Centuries ago, explorers and anthropologists collected tens of thousands of Aboriginal remains, organs, bodies and bones, and donated them to universities and museums abroad for scientific study. But the trade of Aboriginal remains also occurred much closer to home. It may come as a surprise to learn that hundreds have been sitting inside one of Australia's most prestigious universities for nearly a century. 15 years ago, that university, the University of Sydney, began to return them. And the handover hasn't been quick or simple. Caro Meldrum-Hanna reports.
Deep inside the Fisher Library at the University of Sydney, something borrowed is finally being returned.
And then that's Tamworth. So Armidale, Tamworth, Barrow.
This is not your average loan. And today it's the university doing the returning.
So I keep it, they're not too heavy, so you'll be able to take that one.
Since the mid-1990s, the University of Sydney has been slowly handing back what never belonged to it in the first place. Hundreds of sets of Aboriginal remains collected over the course of several decades.
It's just total heart-wrenching stuff. You know, what right have people got to have these remains, you know? Like, how would they feel if it was their relatives, you know? Like, these are actually our ancestors.
They're uneasy because they're not just... They think about the spirits, so they wander around because the remains are not placed back in the ground, in earth.
Being on the grounds of Australia's oldest and most prestigious university isn't exactly a frequent event for respected Aboriginal elder Uncle Bing. But today he has a job to do.
To bring them home and to make sure that they're put in back in country and that the community is satisfied that it's done culturally appropriate and that eases the community and stop all that ill feeling, bad feeling.
In the north of Australia, scientists of the Arnhem Land Expedition set out along the Alligator River to gather specimens.
That bad feeling can be traced back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scientific curiosity about the origins of Aboriginal Australians was at its peak. Fuelled by the notion that the Aboriginal people were a dying race, on the verge of extinction, thousands of human remains were deliberately dug up. Many more were discovered by accident, by farmers, plumbers and rail workers. But instead of returning them to the community from which they came, the remains were given to museums and universities across New South Wales and beyond.
It's disrespectful. It's not human that their remains be taken to be studied and then kept in these institutes to study them, and then years later they find out they're still there.
Does that show a lack of respect?
I don't think necessarily a lack of respect. I think they were being collected by the university.
Dr Denise Donlan has been at the university for 40 years, first as a student and now senior lecturer in anatomy and histology and curator of the Shellshire Museum, where hundreds of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal remains have been kept for decades. It wasn't a matter of grave robbing?
No, there are a very small number which were intentionally excavated by members of the department or possibly other people.
How many?
Well, I think you're probably looking at something like 5 sets of remains. It's actually very small.
I mean, was there any thought to how this would actually affect communities, not knowing that these remains were being looked at and poked and prodded, as one elder said yesterday?
Well, again, I'm not sure I can speak for the people who were doing the teaching at the time, but...
as a student yourself?
Yes, I suppose we were quite removed from that. That's true.
As Aboriginal communities slowly learnt that remains of their ancestors had been removed, studied and kept at universities and museums, appeals for the return of their cultural property began to mount.
Australian Museum had already started a repatriation policy, and so they came here into the Macleay Museum and they wrote a report which recommended that we come up with a policy basically on repatriation.
What were your thoughts? Were you supportive of that?
I found it quite difficult initially. I guess I had very mixed feelings, and I still do, to be quite frank.
In some places, people will look at Aboriginal ancestors and the remains we hold as an anthropological property, something to be kept and to be studied, something that has importance to knowledge.
Are they?
Well, they are, but what's important is that they hold greater significance for people, for living people.
Seen here in the 1960s, the Aboriginal communities of Tamworth and Armidale were completely unaware ancestral remains had been removed. Decades later, and it was only last year that the communities of Barraba, Armidale and Tamworth were finally informed that some of their ancestral remains were actually at the university.
When they find out that the remains are held by an institute, they start to say, well, why are they there? You know, they want to know why they're there, how they got there, how the person die. So it's a bit distorts the community when they say, why has this happened?
It's strong, good. Now, you could imagine in terms of being for scientific purposes for all this period, that these bones had been prodded by everything and by different people would have all looked at it. We have to cleanse them. They need to be clean before they leave these places. So they go home.
7:30 was allowed in to record this important cleansing ceremony.
They've had ceremony interrupted, these 6 remains at some stage. Some of them may never have had ceremony.
It's a very spiritual thing that you feel, and you know that you're doing something that should have been done a long time ago. I feel proud as a person and as an Aboriginal person to be able to do this. We're righting the wrong that was done 90 years ago, and it's taken that long to make it right.
I don't think the university saw it as wrong. I think we probably saw ourselves as a repository, for remains. What would we do with them otherwise?
There are things in the history of the university of which we are incredibly proud, and there are things of which we are deeply ashamed.
Marking the 250th repatriation of remains from the university, Vice-Chancellor Michael Spence didn't hold back.
All sorts of wrong things were done. One of the things that was done wrong was that the remains of Aboriginal people were taken and put in university museums.
I felt that it did send a little bit of the wrong message, and it implied that we had gone out and excavated, with some kind of sinister intention. We excavated burial grounds, and while that may have happened in parts of Australia, it didn't happen with respect to, almost all of this collection.
For 230 years, all our customs and everything were just actually ignored, and everyone had a right to dig us up, to take us away.
While Aboriginal communities mourn the events of the past, anthropologists like Dr Denise Donlan are mourning an entirely different loss.
I feel that there is so much information still to be gained by looking at the remains, that not just for scientists, for anthropologists, but also for the Aboriginal communities themselves.
But for elders like Uncle Bing, the thoughts are less with science and more with spirit.
Things are getting there slowly, and eventually, hopefully, that all the Aboriginal remains will return back to country, and the communities are quite satisfied.